So I never had Asian food until I was an adult. Sounds like a weird way to start things, but it's important you know. Not at all. Like no Chinese food, never had any sushi, no Thai food, no Korean food, just nothing. Like I was at least 19. I was at least a sophomore in college when I first ate this. And you might be wondering, okay, how is that possible? I mean, like, you can barely drive through Columbia without running into one. I mean, there's just a ton of different kinds, and that's the way it is. But y'all, you don't know where I grew up. Where I grew up, there was no Asian food that I know of. Like, I grew up in Indiana, in a small town, like an hour from any kind of real civilization. And we just didn't have much of anything in the way of that kind of food, and I think we came by it honestly, like, we didn't have any Asians either, let's be honest. Everybody in Indiana sort of looks exactly like me. Just shorter hair, less tattoos. Everybody just looks like me, and that's the way it is. So, like, I remember for me, like, somebody who was Asian in heritage, I remember, like, I watched Godzilla movies, and there were Asian people there, and I watched Kung Fu movies, and there was Asian people there, and I watched the Dodgers in 1995, and they had Hideo Nomo, and that was neat. And I would go to the doctor, and my doctor was Asian, and then we had a foreign exchange student who was from Japan. His name was Sho, and I never talked to him, because, whatever. I just didn't. I was kind of a shy kid, so that was my entire scope of Asian people, is stuff I'd see on TV and a couple of random people. And so I just never tried it. So I'm 19 years old, I'm a sophomore in college, and one of my buddies is like, hey, we're going to get Chinese food. You want to go with us? And I said, hey, absolutely not. And he said, why not? And I said, I'm a picky eater, I don't like most American food, let's be honest, so I certainly don't really like Chinese food. And he said, well, let's go. And I was like, well, what am I going to get? And he said, you get General's chicken. And I said, well, what's it like? And he said, it's basically like really salty barbecue, is what he told me. It's basically really salty barbecue. And I was like, well, I like barbecue, and I also like salt a lot, so let's try that. Let's go for that. So I went and I did that, and I ate the General's chicken from this little old man in Moberly, Missouri, who had this little shack of Chinese food. He's not there anymore. I'm not sure he's with us anymore, but his place is certainly not. And I ate it, and it turns out my friend had the absolute worst description for this food ever. This was not salty, nor was it barbecue, and it certainly was not salty barbecue. Like, in no way. And so I was, of course, at first I was like, I don't know why he described it that way. But I decided to forgive him for a couple of reasons. The first reason is dude was from Texas. And in Texas, I'm pretty sure it's just like in their constitution, you have to compare everything to barbecue. So he was just doing his best, trying to follow the law. But the second reason is General's chicken was amazing. Oh my goodness, it was awesome. And then they had that fried rice, and it had little chunks of pork in it, and oh my goodness, it was out of this world. And I'm like, how have I gone 19 years and not eaten this? Like, this is what they should have given me out of the womb. Like, instead of giving me cereal as a child after I was weaned, they should have given me General's chicken. This is incredible. And so then I started eating more and more food. I started eating different things. It took me a while, but Stephanie finally convinced me to try sushi, and that was amazing. And one of my favorite meals I've ever had, it was this Korean barbecue place in LA, and it was out of this world good, and they were on the Food Network, and it was just great. And but my favorite, both Asian food and maybe regular food in general, is Thai food. Thai food. And my favorite place, yes, I am filming a commercial for them right now, is Tip Thai in Colombia. If you've not been to Tip Thai, it is important that the next time you go get any kind of Asian food, you go to Tip Thai, because, it is amazing. Here's how good Tip Thai is, okay? I can go to Tip Thai and order a bowl of vegetables with one of their sauces on it, and I will eat that whole bowl of vegetables and enjoy the whole bowl of vegetables. I'm not sure you guys understand how crazy that is. I haven't eaten vegetables until, like, Tip Thai. I hadn't eaten vegetables since, like, 1994. And I haven't eaten them willingly ever in my whole life. But at Tip Thai, I can get a bowl of vegetables with this sauce on it, and it's so good. And I can sit here and go down the whole menu, but my favorite thing at Tip Thai is they've got these little pot stickers. I don't know if you guys have ever had these pot stickers, but they are basically heaven wrapped up on a plate. So here's the deal. Like on the bottom of it, it's all like crispy and caramelized, and then on top of it, it's all like tender and like pillowy. It's like eating a pillow, but not in a weird way. And then on the inside, it's like pork and vegetables and these seasonings that come from God's pantry. Like it's just perfect. And they've got this other sauce, and I got to tell you, like it's just the best thing ever. And I tell you this not just to film a commercial for Tip Thai, but to say this. So I never had Asian food for 19 years. And so to me, Asian food is still really new. It's still really exciting. Honestly, if I want those flavors and textures, if I want that, I can't go anywhere else. I have to go to an Asian place. And so if I want Chinese food, and by the way, I know it's not Chinese food. I watched that Netflix documentary too. I get it. But, you know, if I want Chinese food, I got to go to a Chinese place. If I want Thai food, I got to go to Thai place. If I want sushi, like there's nothing you can do to give yourself the taste and feel of sushi without just getting sushi. It's brand new, it's novel, and for me at least, maybe not for y'all, but for me, it's completely unique. Now last week, we started talking about what happened in the early church. And we posed a question. How did this happen? I mean, really, historically speaking, taking all faith out of it, historically speaking, you've got a handful, like 4, 5, 6 people at the cross who are Christians. And within 300 years, you have more than 30 million Christians. How do you go from a handful to 30 million? And like we said last week, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm not trying to be sacrilegious here. But, you know, a lot of times we just say, oh, well, God did it. And okay, I suppose that's not wrong. But that level of growth we've not sustained. I don't know if you guys are aware, but 2/3 of the world is not Christian. By the end of the Roman Empire, virtually the entire Roman Empire was Christian. There's a massive difference here in the way that they were able to grow and the way they were able to change their world and the way that we have been able to grow and change our world. And the question I think is important to ask is how? So if you missed last week, we talked about how Christianity is at its core 2 things that sound opposite. It's incredibly, totally, perfectly exclusive in that being that when you worship Christ alone. But it is also perfectly, completely, and totally inclusive, folding in people of various faiths and various ideas who are all welcome into the kingdom. There is no one left out. There is no one excluded at all from that vantage point. And so a big piece of this puzzle is this Christianity that is both fully exclusive, demands that we convert, but fully inclusive, inviting everyone to do just that. So that was one piece of the puzzle we talked last week. This next piece of the puzzle, this morning, we need to understand that Christianity is like Asian food. And because Christianity is like Asian food, that's a massive piece of the puzzle as to why it grew by leaps and bounds the way that it did. But first, before we get to that, we need to dispel with something you might believe that is a massive misconception about the church. So if I were to ask you, or any Christian at all, you, somebody else, I'm not picking on anybody specifically, if I were to ask really any Christian, tell me about the first Christians. What you might say a lot of different things, but at a certain point you probably would be describing, in your mind, if nothing else, you would be describing people that you believed were Jewish. People that were from the Hebrew faith. People that adhered to the religion that is Judaism, and then they became Christians as seeing the fulfillment of Judaism as being Christianity. there's a reason you think this. You think this because, well, Jesus was Jewish, and his disciples were Jewish, and the early church, like when I say early, like the earliest church, the first 10 years or so, it's all Jewish. When you look in the book of Acts, it's predominantly Jewish. The church begins in Jerusalem. The church's head is in Jerusalem. You don't get much more Jewish than ancient Jerusalem. They're preaching in the temple. They're gathering in the temple. You don't get much more Jewish than gathering and worshiping in the temple. So for, we as pastors, as teachers, as ministers, we have really hammered home this idea that we need to understand Christianity in many ways through the lens of Judaism. Without that, you're not going to understand, for example, a lot of the imagery and symbolism that you see in the New Testament. You're not going to understand exactly, when Paul talks about the law, what's he talking about? He's talking about the Jewish law. So you can be forgiven if you think in your mind the earliest Christians, the early church, it's a Jewish faith. But while you might be right for like 10 or 15 years in history, you would be wrong basically every moment after that. And there's a reason for that. And it's the same reason why today there's like 15 million practicing Jews around the world. I don't know if you guys have ever wondered that. Like, if we're the fulfillment of Judaism, if Jesus fulfills the Jewish faith, why are there still Jews wandering around who don't believe in Jesus? And the answer to that question is they disagree with the way we read the Bible. Like every Christmas, we're going to quote Isaiah. It's going to happen. Even if you don't mean to, you almost, when you're writing a sermon at Christmas, you almost just trip and fall and, 6 passages from Isaiah. The same thing happens at Easter when you're quoting like the Psalms or something David said. We read the Old Testament and we see all of these things that sound like Jesus and sound like, okay, well, there's the virgin birth and there's the resurrection and there's the crucifixion and there's Jesus teaching and there's Jesus, his miracles and all of that. I just got to tell you, it's important we know, maybe a side note for what we're talking about, but it's important we know that to a Jewish person looking at the way we read the Bible, it's just laughable. They totally disagree. To them, we are just so ignorant of how you're supposed to read the Bible. And they have a long tradition of that. Back, 1900 years, that's basically what happened. They were able to baptize a whole mess of people. I mean, you've got Pharisees and Sadducees and different religious leaders. They were able to grow a lot of Jewish folks, but they sort of hit a wall. They sort of came up against their ceiling because what was happening was again and again, you would preach and then the Jews would just say, well, that's not how you say that. That's not right. That's incorrect. And so what happened was they sort of stopped growing through the Jews. The truth of the matter is this. In AD 70, about 40 years after the death of Jesus, the temple was destroyed. And the Jews who had all these different little sects, a lot of those sects died out at that point. We may know their names, we may know a little something about them, but after the destruction of that temple, there's no sign of them. And chances are extremely good that if the church had stayed as it was the first 10 or 15 years as a Jewish or predominantly Jewish faith, Jewish sect, it would have died out too. But you see, there was a guy named Paul. And Paul decided, well, this is not something that's for the Jews only. And really, he looked at it and said, this is not even something that's predominantly for the Jews. He knew better than anybody. He had spent his life up till that point. He had spent, the 10, 15 years before his baptism, he spent that persecuting the church. So he knew full well this is not going to work just for the Jews. So what we need to do is we need to go to the Gentiles. And so he plants churches, and he goes to cities specifically preaching to Gentiles. And yeah, he did it through the Jewish temple and all of that, but he called himself an apostle to the Gentiles. He made no bones about it. This is who he was, and this is what he was doing. And so he plants these churches. And by the end of the first century, by 60, 70 years after the death of Jesus and his resurrection, the church is sort of what it looks like now. It's a whole lot of white people, a whole lot of Gentiles, a whole lot of non-Jewish people, a whole lot of people that look like you and me worshiping this Jewish Messiah while the Jews sit it out. So because of that, when we look at the way this church grows, and we talk about why it grew, we need to have a really solid understanding of what they were growing from, what their idea was. I think a lot of times we say, okay, well, it was just very simple. You sat down, you look at the scriptures, you see this sometimes in the book of Acts, you sit down, you open the scriptures, the guy says, oh, cool, that's Jesus, and then he goes to get baptized, and he goes and does the next thing for the next guy. But in the Gentile community, they were Roman pagans. You can open up the scriptures to them, and they don't care. Those aren't their scriptures. Those mean nothing to them. And so what was happening was this church was growing because Paul and others were offering an alternative to what they thought about God. And so now we need to talk about what they thought about God. So if you were a Roman pagan at any point, particularly around the time of Christ, the 200-300 years after, but really even back before that, there are some specific things that you would understand in your relationship to God. But I have to admit, like, even that terminology is hard for me to say because that's not the way they looked at it. Here's what I mean. We think about the idea of believing in God. Do you believe in God? Yes or no? Do you believe in God? Do you not believe in God? For them, if you're an early century Roman pagan, that question is every bit as silly as asking, do you believe that you have a left hand? Do you believe that the sun rises? Do you believe that the Senate is corrupt? Do you believe that the stars will come out and the moon will be there and the rivers flow, and if you plant corn, then it grows? Like, I don't know if they had corn, maybe wheat. But anyway, crops. They took it for granted that God existed, that the gods existed. So this idea of a personal decision, this idea of I believe in God and therefore there's some benefit to me, simply is not on the radar of early Roman pagans. They just understood that the gods existed. Now, that wasn't particularly good news. We think about the gospel as being good news. But for them, it wasn't good news. It also wasn't bad news. The way they looked at the gods were basically the way we look at, I don't know, like a lion. Maybe think about this. Like, if you see a lion kill an antelope mother, leaving behind antelope babies, I don't know, like, maybe that makes you sad. Maybe you think, well, that's nature, you're crazy. But you don't say, well, that lion is a bad lion. You don't say that lion is an unethical lion. That lion is immoral. Doesn't it know that mother needs to feed her young? See, we understand that lions don't play by the ethical rules of people. They just don't. They're lions. They just are. They're not good. They're not bad. They just are, and you shouldn't get in their way. That's exactly how the ancient people saw the gods. The ancient Roman pagans understood the gods to be. They looked at virtually everything. They looked at the fact that people were in love. They looked at the fact that babies were born. They looked at the fact that some people had good luck and some people had bad luck. They looked at the idea that, the sun rises and then it sets and the moon comes out and the stars come out. They looked at the fact that, the wheat grows. All these things that they took for granted. They understood, hey, there's wars and there's hunting and any concept you can come up with, tangible, intangible, whatever. They said the gods did it. What the gods have done is what we see in this world. So the reason people go to war is, well, the gods wanted it. The reason that people are successful on a hunt, well, the gods wanted it. The reason somebody gets sick, well, the gods wanted it. The reason people fall in love, well, the gods wanted it. Not good, not bad, just there. Just the way that it worked. And so because of that, you might imagine that their understanding of the gods, their relationship to the gods, isn't a relationship at all. There is no relationship with the gods. It doesn't matter if they believe in them, it doesn't matter if they like them, it doesn't matter, none of that matters. All that matters is that they try in some way to stay out of their way. Or to manipulate them into doing what they want. So it works sort of like this. Okay, the gods have decreed that my husband will go to war. So every day I will go to the temple of the god of war and I will offer a sacrifice. And if I do that enough, and if I do that as fervently as I can, well, then maybe the God of war will let my husband come home. And if my husband doesn't come home, well, I must have done something wrong. Or if a couple wanted to conceive a child, and they're having a little bit of trouble, you would go to, say, the temple of the fertility deity, and you would worship that goddess, and you would offer your sacrifice, and you would give your prayers in hopes that you and your husband could conceive. And if you can't conceive, well, the goddess, she didn't respond to you, so you must have done something wrong. If you do conceive, praise the goddess. Make sure that, we continue to praise her, because we want to make sure that I carry the baby to full term. This is completely utilitarian. It's completely practical. They saw the gods as basically tools to get what they wanted in the world. They weren't good. They weren't bad. It's not like having faith or trust or hope. That's not it at all. It's more just having the anxiety that if something bad happens in my life, I must have done something to deserve it. It's sort of the fear that catastrophe is around every corner because that's how the gods are. So I better make sure that I don't mess up the way that I worship the gods, so that way I can avoid the catastrophe. It was just that simple. And so it makes sense. This makes so much sense that for them, this life and this world, if you were a Roman pagan, this life and this world was all there was. There was no life after death. There was no heaven to go to. There was none of that. Lots of cultures had very distinct beliefs about the afterlife. You can find that in all sorts of stuff. But Roman pagans really didn't. They saw some of the stuff of the afterlife, they saw those as stories. They didn't see that as real things. When they had a funeral, they understood that guy's gone. And it wasn't bad news. Because imagine you die and then you go spend eternity with a lion. Neither good nor bad. Sort of uncontrollable, very unpredictable. That wouldn't be a great eternity. For them, there was no concept that, okay, the gods are good and we want to go be with them. That wasn't it at all. Or the gods are good and therefore they'll let us live, past this. It was just, let's get through this life, let's live a good life, and that's that. That's going to play massively into what we talk about next week. It was one of the massive changes that happened. So, kind of put a finger there. Massive piece to that puzzle next week. But you can understand, if this is how ancient Roman pagans understood the gods, you can understand why it was like their whole life they'd eaten American food. And then one day, somebody gives them General's chicken. And they're like, oh my goodness. And then somebody gives them a pot sticker from Tip Tie. And they're like, oh my goodness, what is this? If we have even a basic concept of the God that Jesus showed, we see how massively different, but not just massively different, but how massively better that God is than what the Roman pagans understood the deities to be. Here's what we read from a letter by John. At the end of the first century, John is writing, and what's unique about this letter is since it's towards the end of the first century, it's absolutely written to Gentiles. It's written to a group of pagans who had converted and were struggling with their theology as to what to believe about the gods, because their whole lives they'd been one way and now there's something else. So John is writing to them and he's explaining to them who God is. And in 1 John, here's what he writes about God from what they learned from Jesus. He says, this is the message we heard from Jesus and now declare to you. God is light, and there is no darkness in him at all. A little later, a few chapters later, he says, dear friends, let us continue to love one another, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves is a child of God. There's that inclusive stuff again. And knows God. But anyone who does not love does not know God, for God is love. A chapter later, he says, so now we live in fellowship with the true God, because we live in fellowship with his Son, Jesus Christ. He is the only true God. There's that exclusive stuff we talked about last week. And he is eternal life. Think through how different this picture of God is, but also this relationship with God is. He says that God is light. There is no darkness. In other words, God is only good. God is not sort of good and sort of bad. God is not this amoral being that you can't judge like a lion because they just do their own thing. Objectively speaking, we can judge God by our understanding of ethics, and God is only good. Which means that God doesn't do bad things. When bad things happen, that's not God doing it. Which means we don't have to go to God and try to manipulate him into not doing bad things. We don't need to try to manipulate him into doing good things. God is only good. God is light. There is no darkness in him. And so God is love. Love is something that happens. It's a feeling. It's also a choice, but it has to do with relationships. If you were the only human on earth, you really couldn't love much because there's nothing for you to love. You have to have both an object and a subject in the topic of love. So if God is love, that means God is, by his nature, interactive with us. So we, by our nature, are interactive with him. So this idea of not really knowing the gods, not having a relationship with the gods, not any of that, totally blown up here. Jesus shows us a God who loves us. Because how else could he? He is indeed love. And so we have fellowship with that God. Which means we partner with God. That means that we are part of God, God is part of us, and what God is up to in this world is what we are supposed to be up to in this world. When we become Christians, we are saying, God, I will do what you are up to in this world. That's that fellowship. It's partnership. The dumbest illustration ever, but it still works. One of my Bible college professors taught me that fellowship is like two fellows in a ship. It's the dumbest thing ever, but man, does it work. Because you can imagine two people in a rowboat, and if they're going in opposite directions, they're just going to go in a circle. But if it's two guys in a ship, the only way that they're going to go is if they're working together. And that's what fellowship is us working together with God. An incredible concept. If you're a early 1st, 2nd, 3rd century Roman pagan, it's an incredible concept. But then finally, because of that, now it begins to make sense why it is good news that Jesus talks so much about eternal life. Jesus says that when we believe in him, when we make that choice to put our faith in him, that we have passed from death to life because he himself is life. To trust in God is to trust in life. And so that life is not bound by death. We die and life is still there. Christ has conquered death on the cross through the resurrection. And that's good news because now finally we have a God we want to go be with. None of the other gods cared enough. It's not good news to go be with them, but this God to be with for eternity. Well, that's as beautiful as being with this God now. I mean, this was like having General's chicken for the first time. There is no other God like this. There is nothing that they'd heard that was like this. And they assumed the gods existed. Of course they did. They no more didn't believe in the gods than they didn't believe in their left hand. Of course the gods exist. So here's Jesus sharing who God is, who this God of Christ is, and it was clockwork. Yeah, I want a God who loves me. I want a God who doesn't hurt me. I want a God whose only actions are good. I want a God I can have a relationship with because he cares. I want a God that I can be part of and he's part of me. I want a God that's worth living with forever. And so it begins to grow way faster than with the Jews because they're arguing about the Bible. But the pagans, they understand the gods exist, and now here's this new God they're hearing about, and it is beautiful. It is like those pot stickers. It is delicious. And they did not want to let it go. And so when we see in the church what happens, we see it is so beautiful. They're willing, like we talked last week, to turn their backs on the other gods and their other ways of looking at things and say, I will serve Christ alone. They're willing to do that because Jesus is just that good. And then they're willing, as we're going to talk about next week, to completely turn upside down the social order. Just completely blow up their way of looking at community and people and what it means to live an ethical life, and just absolutely to blow it up and start over from scratch. And then as we're going to talk about the week after that, they're willing to share it with other people. Not just to keep this to themselves, but to share it with others as they live their lives. And then as we talk about the week after that, they were willing absolutely to hold on even as the empire killed them over it. And we'll talk about why then. It changed who they were. Because they saw in the God that Jesus showed something they never had before. Something totally unique. But it's not just unique, something that was so good. This morning, we're in our second week of our series called How We Changed the World. We're talking about this crazy, almost absurd level of growth for 300 years that changed the ancient world and set up what we see today. As we talk about why, this morning, the focus, we need to understand, the focus, why we talked last week with Constantine. Why would Constantine do this? Why would anybody do this? And the focus is on the complete, objective, total, beautiful goodness of God. And that's what we need to focus on as well. So we're in our second week of our series of How We Changed the World is this. God is light without darkness. God is love without condition. And God is life without end. Now, I hesitate to finish the sermon because I got to be honest, everything's been happy so far. Talked about Asian food. We're going for lunch now. It's all been very happy. But the question I have to ask is, what does this have to do with us? And when I ask that, I don't know that I like the answer. Because if I'm very honest, I've been in the church way longer than I've been eating Asian food. I've been in the church since I was 4 or 5, probably. I've been a Christian since I was 12. And the God that is light without darkness and love without condition and life without end, I've not heard much about that God. I've heard a mess of sermons and a mess of lessons. I've heard a whole lot about a God that's not like that. Maybe sort of like that. Maybe sort of a mix between the God of Jesus and the God of the pagans. You see, because I've heard over and over that God is light. But yeah, sometimes there's some darkness there. Okay, yeah, God, He does a lot of good stuff, but every now and then, well, He just has to bring that darkness out and got to do a lot of bad stuff too. I've heard about that. And I've heard a lot about a God of love. But man, have I not heard about a God of love without condition. There's always conditions. Always. Every time. Forever. Always conditions. And I don't know how to word this exactly, but I've heard so much about dying and going to heaven. When you die, you're going to go to heaven. When you die, you're going to go to heaven. When you die, you're going to go to heaven. And I got to be honest, I'm tired of talking about dying. I hope not to do it for a while, quite frankly. I mean, if I do, I can't control that, I don't guess, but if I have my druthers, it would be a while. So why am I talking about that instead of how to live? Why do I have all sorts of life affirmation for after I die and no life affirmation now? Too long in the church, all I've heard is about a God that sort of makes me want to die. I'm not saying it's all bad. And we're not all bad. But when you compare a God who is all good to a church that's not all bad, it's not hard to see the disconnect. And I'll be very, very blunt. If we're not talking about the God of Jesus, then we are not talking about anything unique. Nothing at all. I mean, listen, people can get what they get from the church in lots of places. Unless we're talking about the unique God of Christ. If we're just talking about like being a good person or having community or being in a place with friends or, learning what you believe about life and all that, look, you can go online and join a group. You can go get a service club. You can just sit at your house and watch the news all day and, vote the way you want to vote, and they'll tell you what you're supposed to believe. Like, if that's all we're doing, there's lots and lots and lots of places to get people telling you what to believe and how to act and what to be. And when we don't give something that is unique, we simply become one more voice in a world that is screaming at people. And then we wonder, well, why does nobody care about us? Well, maybe because we're giving them nothing that they don't have anywhere else. You see, because I see the early church, and I see what the Roman pagans were able to do, and they grew not solely, but mainly because the way they understood God was turned on its head. They got something unique. And they said, we like it. And so then we in the church look at that and say, oh, cool, we'll give the world everything they've already got, and then wonder why they're not here. And when I talk about the church, of course, I'm not just talking about a building or an institution. I'm talking about us. The truth is, we are called to be people who worship the God of Christ, the God Jesus reflected, the God Jesus is. Light without darkness, love without condition, life without end. When we don't do that, we can't be surprised when nothing changes. But when we do that, when we do see God that way, everything changes. And so we are called to trust not in God, we are called to trust in the God that Christ has shown us, the God that Jesus is. The Bible teaches that when we want to do that, we're to repent and be baptized. Turn our backs to who we used to be baptized into Christ, a symbolic act of that repentance. We can do that anytime. We can do that today. We can do that sometime this week. We can do that literally anytime you want. If you want to do that, you let me know. We'll figure it out. If you're already an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up. We do it. We want to believe in a God who is only good. We want to believe in the God that Jesus showed us. And when we do that, we believe in a God who is unique. We believe in a God that is worth trusting today and tomorrow and forever.